Aligning incentives in supply chains, buyback contract. One way to align incentives in supply chains so that the total supply chain profit is maximized is by using buyback contract. This is one of the possible solutions that allows us to solve the problem of double marginalization. If you recall, this was the problem where a retailer maximizes its own profit, but at the same time reduces the total supply chain profit because it doesn't recognize the true cost of the unit. So here in the buyback contract, recall that we will assume we have a supplier that produces at some cost and then sells to the retailer at a wholesale price. And then retailer in turn sells at a price, and that happens during the season. So it's a seasonal product, and there is a salvage value that the retailer gets at the end of the season. So the buyback contract will assume the following. The supplier will buy from the retailer leftover units at a new price called a buyback price. Additionally, the retailer will have to pay the shipping cost for the units shipped back to the supplier. Notice that shipping costs before were not included, but they could have been part of the cost for the supplier, and so they could have been included there, right? But here there is an additional shipping, so we have to introduce the reverse shipping back upstream the units from the retailer to back to the supplier. And the third assumption we'll assume for now is that supplier's salvage value is the same as retailer's salvage value. But of course, one could revise this assumption and calculate based on a different salvage value at supplier. So how can we design an optimal buyback contract? Well, we have to set this new buyback price, right, um, such that the total supply chain profit is maximized, right? And how can this be done? Well, we will recognize that we can now manipulate retailer's critical ratio because retailer's critical ratio will depend on the buyback price, which determines the salvage value, the new salvage value from the perspective of retailer. The retailer no longer salvages at the salvage value. The retailer will now have a salvage value that is buyback price uh, reduced by this small shipping cost, but mainly it's buyback price, right? So we can say, let's make retailer's critical ratio equal to supply chain's critical ratio. When they are both equal, retailer will order the quantity which is optimal for the retailer, and that will be the same quantity that is optimal for the whole supply chain. So if we calculate retailer's critical ratio, this is the formula here. And if you calculate supply chain's critical ratio, this is the formula, right? And of course, critical ratio is cost of underage divided by cost of underage plus cost of overage, CU divided by CU plus CO. And notice, right, this is CU, price minus cost. And CU here would be price minus cost plus cost minus salvage value. So there is minus cost plus cost, it disappears. And all you see here is price minus salvage value. Of course, that's the critical ratio for the whole supply chain that sees the retail price, the manufacturer's, supplier's cost, and then sees the salvage value for the remaining items. Well, for the retailer, it's the same formula, except that the retailer buys at the wholesale price, not at cost. So the retailer also has a different here salvage value. And as I said, this salvage value for the retailer is buyback price minus shipping cost, right? So remember this formula, that the left side is just retailer's critical ratio, and this right part is supply chain's critical ratio. So to make them equal, we can adjust the new concept, the buyback price, to make this equality satisfied for any given price, cost, salvage value, and for any assumed wholesale price here in the left side. So if you solve it for it, you get this formula that buyback price equals, and here is a calculation. And when this buyback price is set according to this formula, the retailer has an optimal quantity that is equal to the optimal quantity for the whole supply chain, right? So if a retailer orders this quantity, we know the total supply chain profit will be maximized. The only detail is that there are these additional shipping charges, right? Whatever the expected leftover is, right? This will be shipped back to the supplier, and so we have to adjust for this cost. So this additional cost will actually reduce the total supply chain profit, but usually this will be a small reduction. So if we consider our example of the supply chain where a supplier is Zamatia, who produces sunglasses for $35, so that's the real cost, and then sells to UV for $75, that's the wholesale price, and then UV sells for $115 to the customers and liquidates for $25, that's the salvage value. This is, of course, the retail price. And then we have demand normally distributed. This is a seasonal product, if you recall. Then the additional assumption here will be that the shipping cost back from the retailer to the supplier is $1.50. And then if we actually vary the wholesale price, right, it is 75 initially, that's the column, right? But for any wholesale price, we can calculate a buyback price, right? So these are wholesale prices, these are buyback prices, and then we can calculate what is the UV's expected profit under each assumption. This is the line. What is the Zamatia's expected profit, and then what is the total supply chain expected profit? And notice in all cases, right, because we set the buyback price according to our formula, right, calculated based on all the other prices and varying the wholesale price, right, because we set it in an optimal way such that retailers critical ratio matches the supply chain critical ratio, we get always the optimal maximum possible total profit for the whole supply chain, right? So notice by varying the wholesale price, we can kind of decide which breakdown do we get for this total profit. Do we divide it almost equally, or do we give more to UV and less to Zamatia, or more to Zamatia and less to UV, right? But in all cases, optimal quantity that will be ordered by UV, right, would be 404, which is also the optimal quantity for the total supply chain. And so the total supply chain profit is maximized, right? So I want you to see, right, for example, for $75, the buyback price would be $71.50. It's actually quite generous, right? If it accounts for the shipping cost 1.5, actually the salvage value for the retailer is $70, right? In that case, the profit of UV is almost exactly equal to the profit of Zamatia. But actually, this wouldn't be that good because if you recall in our original example, um, Zamatia had over $9,000 of profit, while UV had about over $5,000 of profit. So it would be really great for UV, but for Zamatia, who's probably setting the wholesale price and setting the buyback price and offering it to UV, that wouldn't be so good because it actually reduces Zamatia's profit, right? So that's of course because Zamatia has to pay back for the leftover units that they receive from UV. So actually a better idea here in this particular example is that Zamatia offers the wholesale price higher than originally. Instead of 75, $85, and then offers the buyback price together with it, right? Now it's even closer to 85. Under this assumption, UV's profit will be 6,600, which is more than over 5,000 that UV had. And at the same time, Zamatia's profit is again higher than 9,000 something, right? It's now 11,000. And this is what we meant by saying this is a win-win solution. When you align incentives, you can basically enlarge the total profit, right? It was around 14,000 something. Now it becomes 17,000. When the total profit is higher, both companies can have an increased profit under the right design. So this is an example of applying the buyback contract in order to increase the total profit of supply chain while giving some share of that profit to both stages, both companies involved in the supply chain, right? Of course, there is an additional cost of shipping the leftover inventory back to the supplier, but it's actually quite small. As you can see, it's $241. So it's much less than the increase in the profit, expected profit that UV has, right? So it actually isn't a problem. Notice, of course, that the buyback price is actually quite close to the wholesale price, and this has its own problems. But right, but this is one way to align incentives in the supply chain. Some notes on buyback contracts. Buyback contracts are useful because, for example, they might allow for redistributing inventory across retailers involved in the supply chain. Sometimes when you have too much left over in one retailer, you might have a shortage in other regions for other retailers. Supplier might be in the best position to redistribute the leftover inventory. It also helps avoid markdowns, which is good for supplier, right? Because it protects the supplier's brand image. You can only buy my sunglasses for $115, not for $25 somewhere on a big sale, right? And this can, of course, foil some strategies from strategic buyers who might say, I'm not going to pay so much, I will pay much less, wait for the discount. It also allows the supplier to signal significant marketing effort, right? By offering this buyback price, the supplier says, I really care about the product. I'm confident it will sell well. The costs of buyback contracts are, of course, it's a more complex contract, so there are some administrative costs and, of course, additional shipping and handling, the leftover inventory. Where are they used? They are used in a lot of types of items, right, like books, cosmetics, music CDs, but also, for example, in agricultural chemicals or electronics. So are buyback contracts so useful in every possible case? Of course not. Uh, they are really useful, first of all, when the supplier can dispose of leftover units efficiently, as efficiently, for example, as the retailer, right? If this is not the case, then sending the units back to the supplier might not be the best idea, and the buyback contracts may not actually be a good solution, right? In some cases, supplier can actually redistribute leftover items to other retailers, for example, in regions where the product was selling much better and maybe there are shortages. They are useful, the buyback contracts are also useful only if retailers act responsibly and are well managed, right? For example, if you had an irrational or excessively optimistic retailer that orders maybe double the optimal supply chain quantity, right? Optimal order quantity, then this can create a lot of nervousness for the supplier because the supplier might now be at the risk of paying a very high buyback price, right, for a very large quantity that is expected. Also, this generous return policy is likely to dampen retailers' incentive to sell, uh, especially right when you saw buyback price that is very high relatively to the wholesale price. So, what do we mean exactly by this? Recall in our example, the wholesale price was 85. Let's say that we assumed would be a good idea, and then the buyback price was over $80, even including the shipping cost. So basically, salvage value for the retailer became over $80 after accounting for the shipping cost. And of course, that can lead to problems because now a retailer might say, why should I try hard selling these products? I will get my $80 back, almost the whole wholesale price. I have other products that have much smaller salvage value, right? And for those, I'd rather spend some effort and, when having a choice, I would rather sell those products where I don't have this generous return policy, right? So it makes sense on its own, but given a bigger picture of many products at the retailer, the buyback contract might actually backfire. And also, if you have capacity shortage, and when we discussed, the shortage gaming might be something that retailers engage in, right? Where they inflate their orders in order to actually obtain the quantity that they need, right? This generous return policy that we're giving might exacerbate our problems, right? The retailers might be more likely to inflate their orders because it doesn't hurt them that much. So basically, while you want to right induce retailers to order more in order to have higher total supply chain profit, be careful not to induce them to order too much in some situations.